This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, thank you very much. Forgive me if I say some of these same things, but in the first person. I took leave of Commonwealth leaders collectively at the end of my last Commonwealth Summit in 1989 in Kuala Lumpur. But there were a few heads on whom I called personally before I actually left office in June 1990. Prominently, those who had themselves sustained office throughout my 15 years. Among them was the Prime Minister of Singapore, Harry Lee Kuan Yew. He was, in my judgment, one of the Commonwealth's most brilliant, most effective, and perhaps above all, most plain-speaking leaders. He said to me on that farewell visit, "I hope you don't misunderstand me, but your most important achievement is that you kept the Commonwealth together." I didn't misunderstand him. He was talking about Commonwealth controversies. Commonwealth controversies over the last 15 years, and the CHOGMs at which they were not allowed to feature, they were not allowed to fracture the club or to degrade its values. Actually, I felt rather pleased with the Prime Minister's judgment. It had been 15 years of raging controversy. Yet when I left the Commonwealth, I was assured on all sides that it was incomparably stronger and more widely respected than when I came to office. That, of course, was not all my doing. But there were parts, of course, that I had to play personally. Curiously, my first Commonwealth controversy was before I came to office, and it was in Singapore, with Lee Kuan Yew in the chair at the CHOGM of 1971. I was there as Guyana's young foreign minister. The row, as you've heard, was over Ted Heath's declared intention to sell arms to South Africa under the Simonstown Agreements of 1955, when Britain had handed over the South African naval base near Cape Town to South Africa. In his memoir, Stitches in Time, my predecessor, Arnold Smith, recalled that time. Many writers, he said, have said that the Commonwealth went to the brink of disintegration on the arms sales issue in the months leading up to Singapore in January 71. The crisis was very, very real. Happily, however, no country left the Commonwealth, either then or later on this issue. And several positive programs were an outcome of the meeting, including the launching of CFTC. And Arnold added this: perhaps the major lesson of the arms sales incident is the enormous value of candid consultations among Commonwealth leaders that can head off a crisis and save a member state from an appalling blunder. I have no doubt, said Arnold, that if Heath had gone ahead with large arms sales to South Africa, he would have done even more damage to Britain's standing and influence in the world than Anthony Eden did through the invasion of Suez. He was saved from this because the Commonwealth had matured into a representative association whose leaders acted quickly, spoke frankly, and finally produced a pair of agreements that saved everybody's political face. So the story is as much about the talks that went on quietly from July to December 1970 as it was about the climax at Singapore. One final point from my predecessor, who after explaining how Alec Douglas Hume, Heath's foreign minister, had authored the policy and committed the new Conservative government, wrote this: the main protagonist now at Singapore was Heath himself, who from all accounts had been somewhat doubtful about it earlier. He supported the policy, and this is Arnold writing, he supported the policy not because of any sympathy with South Africa or South African racial attitudes. He supported it because he was an extremely stubborn man who thought that retreating from even an unconfirmed policy was a sign of weakness and would damage the government's credibility in other spheres. I personally was to have much to do with Ted Heath in later life, in the Brandt Commission in particular, and I counted him a friend. But Arnold's account of Heath at Singapore was absolutely right. I only once later in public life encountered anything like such obduracy, and it was again from a British Prime Minister. And the interesting thing is that they had no love for each other. The Commonwealth, and particularly CHOGMs, managed to cope with both of them. But it was a constant challenge, needing constant attention, not least by the Commonwealth Secretary General. Had the Commonwealth not existed, Heath would have produced and proceeded with his Suez-style plan. The Commonwealth-wide effort to divert him from it was to have the effect of saving Britain from another Suez-like fate. It took a major effort of diplomatic cajolery from many quarters of the Commonwealth to calm the Heath fury, including, of course, the insistent urging of the Commonwealth Secretary General with the Foreign Secretary, with FCO officials, and of course with Ted Heath himself. So in this case, the very fact of the Commonwealth's existence became an element of resolution. But of course the truly critical element was CHOGM. In fact, getting to CHOGM in Singapore in January 71, before he made a fatal decision or announced one, became a substantial objective. And it was at CHOGM that the enabling value of face-to-face consultations was put to the test, where Ted Heath could not avoid the fury of Obote, the pleading of Kaunda, the incisive reasoning of Nyerere, where Trudeau's urgings reminded him that it was not a black-white issue, and Indira Gandhi's resolve, conveyed through her wise Foreign Minister Swaran Singh, was a serious signal. At Singapore, all this induced in Alec Douglas Hume a spirit of moderation, and induced in Heath, after bloody battles and without retreat, a slowing of the charge. The movement away from crisis was helped by Kaunda's sponsorship of the Declaration of Commonwealth Principles, around which consensus could be built. With Trudeau's assistant, Ivan Head, with Kaunda's assistant, Mark Chona, I had a hand in polishing the draft declaration with words such as these: no country will afford to regimes which practice racial discrimination assistance which in its own judgment directly contributes to the pursuit or consolidation of this evil policy. Never ignore the great value to the Commonwealth of the English language and the fact that everyone around the table understands the unspoken. This was enough in the end to stem the crisis. Ultimately, he sold to South Africa only 7 Wasp helicopters, no other arms. And those helicopters were the minimum his law officers advised him he was obliged to sell. The next year, 1975, I was elected Secretary General and faced my first CHOGM in 1977. And at that first CHOGM, I faced controversies of a very different kind, presenting new challenges to the Commonwealth. The foremost of these concerned the behavior of one of our members at a time when globally, quote, interfering in internal affairs, closed quote, had a much longer reach than it does today. But when also the right to speak out against intolerable behavior within domestic frontiers was simply crying out to be acknowledged. At the end of the Singapore CHOGM, before President Milton Obote could leave for Kampala, General Idi Amin seized power in Uganda in a midnight coup. It did not take long for Amin to show the horrific nature of his cunning and of his evil. In August 71, Colin Legiam would be reporting in the London Observer of the massacre of Akoli and Langi soldiers loyal to Obote. And so it continued. In 1977, Obote gave details to the OAU, in writing, of course, of the horrible deaths of some 80,000 Ugandans under Amin's regime. But much sooner, in August 1972, had come the bizarre demand that Uganda's 80,000 Asians must leave the country within 90 days, creating displacement problems of such international proportions that Britain, while taking 28,000 of the Uganda Asians, spoke out aloud, although they did not actually propose it, spoke out aloud about Uganda's expulsion from the Commonwealth. Matters continued to deteriorate, but the OAU in the meantime had recognized Amin's Uganda almost from the beginning, and he sheltered in that haven. Many African nations were, of course, quite ashamed of events in Uganda, and they were outraged by Amin's atrocities. But they felt constrained in acting against him, even within the OAU. Why? Because of the principle of non-interference in international affairs, of international affairs of states, that was actually enshrined in the OAU Charter, and the reluctance was not limited to Africa. The UN was itself similarly inhibited, however strongly its member states felt about what today we would call crimes against humanity. Because Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter says, and still says, nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present Charter. But this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. Now, what did this mean for CHOGM in London? Did it mean that the Commonwealth could do nothing on the evils of Amin? As Secretary General, I believed it was my duty to encourage the Commonwealth to stand by its own principles on the basic issues of human rights. Principles reflected in that Singapore Declaration of Commonwealth Principles. In the introduction to my report in the run-up to the London meeting, I confronted the issue in this way. There will be times in the affairs of the Commonwealth when one member's conduct will provoke the wrath of others beyond the limits of silence. Any other relationship would be so sterile as to be effete. What we must work for is an ethic which constrains meddling, but which also inhibits excesses of the kind that demand and justify protest from without. There never will be unanimity that criticism or complaint is legitimate comment, not improper interference. But the truth is that although the line may be indefinable, all the world will know when it has been crossed. End of quote. Now, ever since Trudeau's innovative 1973 CHOGM in Ottawa, the retreat of heads over the weekend, straddling the meeting as it then was, had proved its substantive value. I had encouraged Jim Callaghan, who had succeeded Wilson at the UK Prime Minister and as chairman of the 77th CHOGM, to make full use of the retreat mechanism. He needed no urging. For my part, I had several stratagems for the retreat, which for the Secretariat was an integral part of the conference, not a break in the conference. And one of them, of course, concerned Uganda. I had discussed my ideas with Callaghan, who was as aggrieved as anyone by Amin's antics and their wounds to the Commonwealth image. Essentially, I hoped to use the ideas I had advanced in the report to encourage Commonwealth heads to break new ground in international institutional practice by condemning Amin and his regime's inhumanities in Uganda. The world, of course, has made great progress since then in blunting, and in blunting in a good way, the constraints of the non-interference principle. But I assure you, in 1977, it was still Holy Script. Of course, I had done some homework with leaders like Trudeau, Kaunda, Nyerere, Michael Manley, Indira Gandhi, and Malcolm Fraser. And at the retreat, I argued the case for the Commonwealth speaking out in condemnation of one of its members. The line, I said, had been crossed in Uganda. The entire world knew it had been crossed. The Commonwealth's own principles had been grossly violated. Let us give a lead to the world in standing against evil. With the homework done, I didn't have to argue. The Commonwealth's leadership was with me. African leaders prominently so. I had prepared some paragraphs as a basis for the retreat's conclusion and for inclusion in the communique. With minor adjustments, the heads adopted them. There was no more discussion of this at the retreat or in the plenary when the communique was adopted, containing the following under the heading Human Rights. They are interesting to recall. Recalling the Singapore Declaration of Commonwealth Principles, heads of government reiterated their belief in the fundamental rights of all men to life and liberty, to those personal freedoms that are the common heritage of their peoples, and to respect for human dignity and the equal rights of all men. Mindful that the realization of these rights the world over was a continuing, a faltering pursuit, they reaffirmed their commitment to advancing respect for human rights in all their fundamental aspects, for economic, social, and cultural rights, no less than for civil and political rights. The effective enjoyment and protection of these rights was a cause to which the Commonwealth was resolutely committed. Cognizant of the accumulated evidence of sustained disregard for the sanctity of life and of massive violation of basic human rights in Uganda. It was the overwhelming view of Commonwealth leaders that these excesses were so gross as to warrant the world's concern and to evoke condemnation by heads of government in strong and unequivocal terms. Mindful that the people of Uganda were within the fraternity of Commonwealth fellowship, heads of government looked to the day when the people of Uganda would once more fully enjoy their basic human rights, which were being so cruelly denied. Derek Ingram, I believe, is here. In an interview after the summit with him, as he was even then the doyen of Commonwealth journalists, an interview later carried in the round table, I was asked, what in terms of Commonwealth history do you see as the significance of the statement on Uganda made in London? In my answer to Derek, I said this: perhaps the most important of its elements is the moral strength that the Commonwealth demonstrated in standing by its own Declaration of Principles, its own commitment to truly fundamental human rights, basic human dignity, life itself. I believe that it greatly strengthened the self-respect of the Commonwealth. As important considerations, altogether, although not often mentioned in so many words, is the fact that it emphasized the truly non-racial character of the Commonwealth, in that it spoke out in condemnation of what it regarded as tyranny, whether the origins were in a white or a black leadership. It also helped to dissolve what I regarded as a myth that national sovereignty in some kind is some kind of shield behind which every unspeakable horror can take place, with the rest of the international community behaving as if it were not taking place at all. The notion that it is bad form, particularly among friends and within an association of nations, to recognize fundamental evil within the group. That refutation can have long-term significance for the Commonwealth and for the international community. That was my conversation with Derek in 1977. Commonwealth principles, Commonwealth values called for us to speak out. CHOGM was the place to do it. Within weeks, the UN in Geneva had followed suit. Now let us move on. Harold Wilson's record over racism in Southern Africa, in Southern Rhodesia, had been, as you will all recall, less than resolute. Certainly less resolute than his dumping of the Simonstown Agreement. He never got over responsibility for UDI. Responsibility for UDI in the first place. when he assured Ian Smith publicly that force would not be used by Britain. It was a disastrous encouragement of which Smith took full advantage. Thereafter, to the end of his first term, 1964 to 1970, and right through his second, 1974 to 76, he simply vacillated while the UDI regime grew stronger. The controversy simmered through Jim Callahan's 1976 to 79 term and boiled over when the Tories won in 1979 under Margaret Thatcher, pledged in her manifesto to recognizing a Smith collaborationist Muzorewa government. I called in the new Prime Minister at Downing Street on the 18th of June, before her visit to Australia. My purpose was, in the first place, protocolary, a courtesy call on Mrs. Thatcher after her sweeping victory. But my visit had a more substantive purpose as well. Commonwealth Heads of Government were due to meet in Lusaka, Zambia, in 6 weeks' time, on the 1st of August. And Rhodesia, of course, would be high on the agenda, given recent developments. I believe that, taken as a whole, events were moving towards the possibility of a negotiated settlement. First, of course, was the overwhelming negative response to the internal settlement that Smith had generated, and to recognition of the Muzorewa government. Ian Smith's options were in fact closing down, and the Civil War, which is what the armed struggle had developed into, was becoming intolerable to white Rhodesians. By the end of the year, 95% of Rhodesia would be under martial law. Its burden on the frontline states was almost as heavy, on Tanzania and on Zambia especially. Nigeria's new militancy on the side of the nationalist forces and its particular hostility to Britain was a new factor. 3 weeks after Mrs. Thatcher's election, Nigeria, then Britain's largest trading partner in Africa, Nigeria rejected all British tenders for a £101 million port project. It was said bluntly by the Nigerians, until the British government clarifies its attitude on Rhodesia to Black Africa, the Nigerian government is not prepared to entertain any new proposals from British companies. Nigeria was adding economic clout, which the frontline states were unable to bring to bear on Britain. It had the attributes of being a game changer. CHOGM had to be made to work to end the status quo in Rhodesia. I did not recite all this to Mrs. Thatcher. My essential concern, as you have heard, was the upcoming summit in Lusaka. I knew Mrs. Thatcher was worried lest she was flying into a hornet's nest. I needed to dispel that anxiety and to ensure that, of course, that I delivered on the promise. Before I had called on her, I had talked with both Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda and told them of the need to surprise Mrs. Thatcher by their calm reason and by our orchestration of the agenda to ensure a dialogue devoid of recrimination, the choreography that was talked about. They had accepted my analysis and my counsel, and they promised their cooperation. It was on that basis that I assured Mrs. Thatcher that while her known views would not be shared, there would be no ganging up on her. I pleaded, however, that she needed to send a signal that whatever else they disagreed on, she, like the rest of the Commonwealth, was committed to black majority rule in Rhodesia. Let the argument be about how collectively the Commonwealth gets there. Mrs. Thatcher responded, I thought, with studied interest. She saw, I believe, the good sense in my suggestion, including my promise of a civilized dialogue. From that point, it was a short step to thinking positively about the summit's outcome. I urged on her, of course, that all these prospects would be shattered by Britain's precipitate recognition of the Muzorewa government, the danger of implementing the manifesto on which she came to power. I avoided talk about free and fair elections and focused instead on the deficiencies of the Constitution under which Muzorewa was elected, recalling the Secretariat's analysis of the Constitution and the unanimity of all save Britain on the issue. Mrs. Thatcher gave me no assurances, but I left Downing Street believing that her intellect was contending with her instincts. Lusaka started with the visit of the Queen. She had made state visits before Lusaka to Tanzania, to Malawi, and to Botswana, all before arriving in Zambia. Everywhere she had received a rapturous welcome from the people of the country. They were all, of course, republics, but she was the head of the Commonwealth. And it was well known that there was distance between her and Mrs. Thatcher on African issues. Well before Mrs. Thatcher reached Lusaka, the Queen had ensured that the Commonwealth Summit would commence in a spirit that was positive to progress on the Rhodesian issue. Mrs. Thatcher arrived close to midnight on the day before the conference opened. She had traveled with her Foreign Minister, Lord Carrington, but from the moment of her arrival, she made it clear that she was in charge, a fact that was to be of great value. Her account of the journey from London, in her own words, in the Downing Street years, makes fascinating reading. I quote from it. We had put the long flight out to good use, working through the precise approach we should take. I had a first-class team of advisors, and of course a first-class foreign secretary, with whom I had a lively exchange when he suggested that our mission was really a damage limitation exercise. At that time, as I told him, it was a phrase I had never even heard. I said that I wanted to do better than that. And between us, in the end, we managed to do so. A damage limitation exercise. That was how Lord Carrington saw Lusaka flying out from London. It was a wholly negative view, and one which Mrs. Thatcher could not share. She had come to Lusaka having weighed all the factors. Her intellect had won the contest with her instincts, and not even her foreign secretary could deflect her now from being positive. Her role at Lusaka would be to work for agreement. She could be forced back to her instincts, but avoidance of that would depend on the good sense of her colleagues and on good conference management. The latter, my personal responsibility. I knew that Kaunda and Nyerere would be faithful to the strategy we had worked out. And I now had a notable ally in the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Fraser. At an early stage, he had taken an enlightened view of the futility of the internal settlement, and had actually urged Mrs. Thatcher soon after her election against recognition of Muzorewa. He had done the same thing to the new Canadian Conservative Party Prime Minister, Joe Clark. He visited Nigeria en route to Zambia to talk with General Obasanjo. He was closely in touch over a long period with Michael Manley of Jamaica. Working with Malcolm Fraser was not new. I had already worked harmoniously with him in 1977 in securing the Gleneagles Agreement during the London Commonwealth Summit. I told him of my strategy of not ganging up on Mrs. Thatcher, and my promise to her that it would not happen. I said to him that I had Julius and Kenneth on board and would brief Michael when he arrived. I then asked him to set the tone for agreement at Lusaka by being the first Prime Minister to speak at the formal public opening ceremony. I then outlined to Fraser what I had already agreed with Kaunda as chairman, namely that though the conference would start on Wednesday, we would hold back the item on Rhodesia until Friday, and then ensure that it was taken on Friday afternoon, and for only a short while before adjourning to the following Monday. The idea would be to allow for private consultations over the weekend so that when the debate resumed on Monday, progress would have been made. My very private hope was that it would never need to be resumed. This would be achieved, as you have heard, by inviting all heads to an outing on Saturday to Victoria Falls, and then very quietly inviting a handful of heads to stay back in Lusaka. A handful that I believe could find a way forward if the environment was right. The environment, I hoped, would have been created by the speeches at the opening and the Nyerere Thatcher openers of the short debate on Friday. And of course, always by the presence of the Queen in Lusaka. The select group would be invited to a private discussion on Saturday as in President Kaunda's small study in his State House. They would be invited to explore the possibilities of a Commonwealth agreement on the Rhodesia issue. Those to be invited would be Malcolm Fraser, Margaret Thatcher, along with Peter Carrington, who I assured her would be welcome, Michael Manley, Major General Adefope of Nigeria, Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, and his personal assistant, Mark Chona. Only Fraser, Thatcher, Nyerere, and Kaunda knew the full procedural game plan when the conference began at Mulungushi Hall on Wednesday, the 1st of August. After initial welcoming remarks by President Kaunda and myself, there were 3 opening speeches in reply by Prime Minister Fraser, Mrs. Thatcher, and in between them, the President of Bangladesh. In my own remarks, I stressed the Commonwealth's significance, both generally and in the special context of Southern Africa. I wanted to make it clear that this was the Commonwealth's moment to undo the wrongs that history had allowed to linger unrequited for so long. Malcolm Fraser was the first Prime Minister to reply, and his speech was all I expected it to be. He said, inter alia, on Rhodesia, first, it is vital that we recognize and build on the substantial areas of agreement which exist among us on these issues, that we are not dominated by negative aspects. Formidable as the differences on some issues are, I believe that as far as those of us present at this meeting are concerned, they are differences about means and not timing, not about ends. We must not allow means to dominate ends. Malcolm Fraser had erected, I believe, the stage on which Mrs. Thatcher could show that she was not dominated by negative aspects, was not in Lusaka for damaged limitations. In her closing remarks, she said, "The UK has pledged to exercise its constitutional responsibility for Rhodesia. The aim is to bring Rhodesia to legal independence on a basis which the Commonwealth and the international community as a whole will find acceptable. and which offers the prospect of peace for the people of Rhodesia and her neighbours. As I said in the House of Commons last week, the British government are wholly committed to genuine black majority rule in Rhodesia. When she ended, there was general acclamation, led prominently by Nyerere. There was a sense among all present that the conference was off to a promising start. The public opening ceremony was all I could have wished. It was especially important on this first business occasion, with all the world media on hand, that Mrs. Thatcher, as I had promised, was treated with courtesy and not backed into a corner in return. She had significantly advanced the prospect of consensus. The stage was set for the private debate on Friday afternoon. As planned, Julius Nyerere opened the discussion on Rhodesia. His remarks were a model of calm reasoning and quiet conciliation. He avoided history and histrionics. He started with a call for the necessary constitutional conference to establish majority rule, saying, Britain had the responsibility, the experience, and he hoped the political will to produce such a constitution and to put it on an all-party constitutional conference. The Commonwealth might also have some local knowledge or other special qualifications to help in that exercise. Everyone knew that a constitutional conference would be necessary to return Rhodesia to legality. But this was the first articulate call for such a conference. Against his delegation's advice, he was prepared to have a resettlement fund for whites who chose to leave rather than stay under an African government. And he said so. Nyerere stressed that it was on these 3 points, and especially on the first 2, that he hoped a Commonwealth consensus for action could be obtained. He had been encouraged, he said, by Mrs. Thatcher's statement at the opening session that the British government was wholly committed to genuine black majority rule in Rhodesia, and that its aim was to bring Rhodesia to legal independence on the basis which the Commonwealth and the international community as a whole would find acceptable. He was looking forward to a more specific statement of the British government's proposals and plans. As if answering Nyerere, Mrs. Thatcher's earlier talk of terrorists, Nyerere said that it was necessary to remember that those who were fighting for the liberation of their country were doing so not because they preferred the bullet, but because the ballot was denied them. That was the tone of these protagonists. President Moi followed, and then Mrs. Thatcher. She too was calm and without recrimination, and certainly without dogmatism. She stressed the recent changes in Rhodesia and said it was the British government's view that the opportunity created by them should be exploited to see if the solution for so long elusive could now be found. She said her government had consulted widely in the Commonwealth and internationally, and certain common factors had clearly emerged. These common factors she seemed to be explaining more to her party at home than to her audience in Zambia, left Britain no other course. The first and most fundamental was the view that the constitution under which Bishop Muzorewa had come to power was defective in certain important respects. That put to rest the issue of recognition and opened the way to consideration of alternatives of achieving genuine black majority rule, which he reaffirmed was her goal. But there was more. It was Britain's constitutional responsibility, she said, to grant legal independence on that basis, and that only Britain could do it. Next, the objective must be to establish that independence on the basis of a constitution comparable with the constitutions which Britain had for her other countries. Not quite.
Few minutes.
Britain was deeply conscious of the urgent need to bring peace to the people of Rhodesia and the neighboring countries. Mrs. Thatcher ended with these words: "There was now a chance to achieve that, and it must be taken." There was a sense in Mulungushi Hall that the debate was over. Certainly, the chairman and I believed that further discussion could not improve on what had been said. Yes, there was more to resolve, but we needed to hold on to that moment of accord, the like of which the Commonwealth had not known for 19 years since UDI. And we were right. 8 short interventions followed, Sir Dawda Jawara of Gambia ending by saying he had no doubt that after their private discussions of the weekend, Commonwealth leaders would be able to see some light, leading to a fairly early solution of that crucial issue. On that note, the chairman closed the discussion and adjourned the plenary until the following Monday. They would resume on Monday morning. The debate had begun at 9:45 and ended at 1:10 on the Friday. 3 hours and 23 minutes. That Friday night, in my villa in the Mulungushi village, bungalow, I sat alone with the transcripts of Margaret Thatcher and Julius Nyerere speeches. The New Zealand Prime Minister had put into words what all who listened to them must have felt. Their views overlapped to such a great extent that there seemed a very real chance of achieving a positive result by the end of the meeting. The next step must surely be to identify those areas of overlap and give them shape in an overall agreement. And that, I felt, was my immediate task. I had to have ready by the following morning draft heads of accord based on those areas of overlap. And so I did. 9 short sentences, 9 points of light to guide the discussion. I had them typed up on half sheets that I could pass around at the appropriate moment. The heads and ministers, save those who had been asked to stay back, left for Livingston and Victoria Falls. At around 10:30, our stay back group assembled at State House. I was there joined by Kenneth Kaunda and Julius Nyerere, Malcolm Fraser and Michael Manley, Margaret Thatcher and Lord Carrington, and Nigeria's Minister Adefobi, a group of 8. I indicated how I had spent my previous night, pulling together the points that had been made in the plenary by Nyerere and Thatcher, pulling them together into heads of agreement on the way forward. Using in most places their exact words. I said I made copies of the informal draft and would pass them around in the hope that they might help the process of developing a concrete plan. I did so. And after everyone had a chance of reading my 9 points, the chairman thanked me, saying he believed I had captured the essence of the opening consensus and suggested that the draft might form the basis of our continuing discussion. The group agreed, and eventually, with very little change, they were to emerge as paragraph 15 of the communique of the Lusaka CHOGM. I was asked to tidy up the draft with Sir Tony Duff, a good friend of mine from the Foreign Office, on Mrs. Thatcher's delegation, and with President Kaunda's personal assistant, and to have it cleared after lunch with the group. We did both without difficulty. The idea then was that the Secretariat would have copies ready for distribution at the resumption of the plenary on Monday morning, when the chairman would explain the discussions over the weekend and invite the colleagues to accept what became known as the Lusaka Accord. The consensus on change. After 19 years of an illegal racist regime in Rhodesia, after years of effort at the United Nations and of Commonwealth sanctions, after the escalation of war that touched not only the country itself, but also the neighboring countries of Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique, after threats to the ability of the Commonwealth itself, was a monumental achievement for the Commonwealth. On Monday morning, on the resumed item on Rhodesia, the chairman, in a few words, stated what had transpired over the weekend, including agreement of all heads on the conclusions of the negotiating group that had worked on Saturday. It was, he believed, a victory for the highest traditions of the Commonwealth and a chance for peace in Zimbabwe. In view of the agreement reached, he proposed that there be no further debate on the agenda item. It had been the shortest and least acrimonious debate on Rhodesia in the long history of Commonwealth summits. I felt I had delivered on my promise to Mrs. Thatcher in London weeks before. In her final press conference, she did a rather unusual thing. She described me as a superb Secretary General. Perhaps she had recalled the promise too. The Lusaka CHOGM was a special example of what such occasions can accomplish with effective management before them and after them. Now I have had a signal from my left that we should move on to questions. I had intended to speak some more about South Africa and apartheid, and I wanted to end with some words which I still want to end with. It is this. A final word about CHOGMs. They are the heart and soul of the Commonwealth system. Pierre Trudeau once told me that if the heads of government meeting was the only thing there was about the Commonwealth, it would be worthwhile for him. He was talking about the interaction of Commonwealth leaders, of getting to know them more than socially, of understanding a different point of view, of challenging it, of sometimes converting to it, or converting others away from it. Like me, he probably did not care too much for the acronym, but CHOGMs mattered, as I hope what I have said has shown. And something flows from that. CHOGMs matter so much that I always believed their venue should be seen as a Commonwealth asset and used purposefully to serve Commonwealth ends. Not the ends of heads more intent on circuses or diversions for domestic reasons than serving the Commonwealth. On my watch, I guarded the venue decision to ensure that it was the right one for the Commonwealth at the time when the meeting takes place. That meant, of course, that the decision must not be taken too early. I tried to leave it as late as possible, and to leave it to consultations by the Secretary General in between meetings. I suspect the Commonwealth has suffered from abandoning this approach and would do well to get back to it. CHOGMs, after all, are the Commonwealth. They are the Commonwealth at its most effective. Their venues, including their chairing, must contribute to that effectiveness. If it does not, that CHOGM will weaken the Commonwealth, not strengthen it, as every CHOGM should.
Thank you very much indeed.
With apology.
That was absolutely wonderful. We've got about half an hour until 4 o'clock for questions. Okay, my boss says 4:15, so I think that's a very good idea. So the floor is open. As I said, please identify yourselves before you ask a question, and keep your questions fairly brief. Who wants to start? Rita. You're got to speak up a bit.
Okay, I'm from the Commonwealth Journalists Association. Just a quick question: if you had been dealing with this particular CHOGM, how would you have handled this whole Sri Lanka business? Are there 3 points that you could?
If I was dealing with
If you were dealing with the current CHOGM, how would you have dealt with the Sri Lanka issue?
Let me say what is difficult about your question. An old Secretary General must not second guess his successors. He isn't privy to all that has happened. None of us are. If you had asked my predecessor before Lusaka, he wouldn't have known how to answer because he wouldn't have known all that I had done. So I must start by acknowledging that I don't know all that might have been done. What I do know is that had I been on the scene, I think my first instinct would have been, knowing that Sri Lanka was at all stages a sensitive venue, would have been to avoid Colombo for as long as I could, and certainly not take a decision 3 or 4 years before the event. At a time when the one thing I could be sure of is that nobody would know what the mood would be in the capital at that time. So that's one of the matters I had in mind in those words which I closed. The second thing is that I think I would have tried, and again this may have been done, I would have tried to do a great deal of consultation with heads of government. The government of Canada has decided not to go in protest. I'm sure I would have had long conversations with the Prime Minister of Canada. And with many others. The Secretary General, it seems to me, whoever he is, really has a duty to make CHOGMs work. If I was to give a title to this, what I've said to you, I would say, making CHOGMs work. Because if the CHOGM doesn't work, the Commonwealth doesn't work. And enormous effort must go into making it work in advance of CHOGM. Now, if that is not done, the prospects at Colombo would not be very bright. If it hasn't been done, I think we must acknowledge that it has a chance. The other thing I think I would have urged is that everybody should turn up, especially those who felt strongest. I think I agree with the British Foreign Secretary's remarks that nothing is beneficial in an empty chair. Had I had many empty chairs in all I've talked about, I could not have managed. The essence of CHOGM is getting people there of discordant views to thrash it out face to face. I tell you, I have had some really fierce contentions at CHOGMs, but none could have been worse than Heath at Singapore. I tell you, I have never seen obduracy of that level. And yet I cannot square it with the Heath I later knew. That's why I think Arnold Smith got it right. This was stubbornness. So, what else can I tell you?
Can I ask a follow-up to that? I mean, at CHOGM now we have a problem that you didn't have, which is the post of chair in office. I mean, what disturbs a lot of people is not just the CHOGM taking place in Sri Lanka. Okay, let there be a massive argument about it. But it's then for the next 2 years, President Rajapaksa would be chair in office of, and in a sense, the international international representative.
I'm quite sure what my attitude to that would have been.
Yeah.
I would have used all the influence I could as Secretary General to discourage the heads of the government from pursuing that system, which, in my view, is a system fraught with danger, as we have seen, and not only in Sri Lanka. And therefore, I suppose what I'm saying is that the recommendation that was made by the EPG to move away from that was absolutely correct. So Ronald is here.
Yeah. Please, yes.
Do you think if Secretary General Commander Sharma could use the
Who is he?
schema?
Oh, could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Lassie from British Telephone. I just wanted to know, do you think Secretary General Commander Sharma could use the schema which was held in the UK to maneuver the location of Commander's meeting in Sri Lanka? Or he could have the advice. He has seek for advice, but he didn't take it into account into the war crimes from Sri Lanka. Do you think he could really make some changes, not to, give the chairman of these Commonwealth countries to Sri Lanka?
Could the Council Secretary General use CMAG to perhaps alter the venue of the CHOGM?
Based on
It doesn't seem to me that the question of venue lends itself to CMAC, which is to deal with contentions and behavior. Sure, I am for a system in which the Secretary General has the maximum opportunity and authority to settle matters in the interest of the Commonwealth. Passing it to a committee, passing it to groups of governments destroys that flexibility. The diplomacy of the Secretariat is what must be given the best chance to work.
There is a question.
Sonny Pepper, I was in PAD in the Secretariat from 1995 to 2000. Whilst the Commonwealth embraces a third of the population of the world, the leadership and the elite group has always been much smaller than that. And I would propose that up until probably quite soon, there was a fraternity there was a shared, so something you mentioned, the language issue. I would also add education, and that there was a sort of a common understanding amongst that leadership and elite group. If the Commonwealth is not to become what Professor Murphy has so interestingly described as a dead parrot, should we not accept now that time and tide stands for no man, generations are passing, and we need to think about modernizing with a more rigorous, I would say professional, transparent injection into the recruitment of the Commonwealth's CEO, that is the Secretary General.
I mean, yeah, does the organisation need I mean, I suppose that the point is that in the 1950s, 1960s, you had a group of leaders who had often a sort of common upbringing, common sort of points of reference, and that's no longer the case. Does the whole nature of the organisation need rethinking, reinvigorating?
And I'm speaking specifically about the Secretary General. Specifically about the leadership point and the Secretary General. Because that is, we're in a different place now, and I think the assumptions of that commonality will, frankly, with people even of my age, very soon no longer be there. So how do we how do we move to a different way of selecting this Secretary General?
Well, you say that commonality, that group spirit no longer exists. Why? Have people changed? Or have our methods changed? We could not have had the achievements in handling controversies that we have talked about and others in CHOGMs that occupy about 2.5, 3 days, surrounded by a panoply of sideshows with foreign ministers meeting in advance. You needed time, you needed camaraderie, you needed what Trudeau understood to get to know people, to get to know each other, to play a round of golf together. Do you think they can do that in Colombo? In 2 days? There is no time for the CHOGM magic to work, I believe. And it is the loss of that, not any change in people, that accounts for what the decline you require, that you describe. If we need a process to get back to that, well then, we need a process. But it is a tragedy that we lost it, because it is always easier to cut down than to build. And we had a CHOGM process that, in my view, was perfect. And we have pandered to kind of bureaucratic impulses to trim, to shorten, to no good end. To no good end. So we need to do that kind of examination. The EPG did part of it. Where are the results of the EPG? A charter.
Peter.
Sir, Shridath haven't answered the question about whether we need a new way of appointing the Secretary General.
Okay, well let's just take it. Should there simply be a new way of appointing the Secretary General? Yes.
I thought the way that appointed me was perfect. What is required is not a new way, it's judgment. A judgment of what the Commonwealth needs at a particular time. Not least of all does it need rotation. Because that could be part of the death knell. It needs the right man or woman at the right moment. And if you miss that, you're in trouble. So a great deal more thought, I think, has to be given. Not necessarily some new mechanism.
Okay. Okay, you've been very good. Thank you. Brief question.
In this extremely complex world, the intergovernmental organizations, including the Commonwealth, are not rigorous enough to deal with the problems. They need revamping.
So you agree that the Commonwealth itself needs rethinking, the Commonwealth in particular or other organisations?
All the governmental organizations,
Okay.
particularly the Commonwealth.
Peter.
Thank you. Peter Stanley, I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. We, of course, have had long interaction with successive Secretary Generals, successive heads of legal and constitutional affairs in the Secretariat. I mean, I know this is a difficult thing to comment upon, but I'm tempted to say that if person of the calibre of the late lamented Jeremy Pope was advising the Secretary General today, we would not be in the pickle that we're in. But the other question I have, one preempted by your last answer about the difficulty of having meaningful discussions in the new way that the CHOGM is constructed. But also I get the impression that over the last few years there's been a kind of deep split of the Commonwealth, that this is much more difficult to achieve consensus. Now, in a sense, it was rather simple, much simpler over Rhodesia, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to say more about South Africa, but that was a question of a very broad consensus, chivvying Britain into some kind of accommodation. But it does seem now that there's a much broader split in the Commonwealth between the, what I'm most tempted to describe as the old, what used to be known as the old dominions, in other words, the white developed Commonwealth and the emerging Commonwealth, despite the fact that you would have thought there are now more countries in the middle way. Medium income or high income countries which don't belong to that traditional.
Well, have we made it so? There was no more obvious example of a split between the ABC countries and the rest. Then the economic issues that preoccupied the Commonwealth in the 70s and 80s, but that led to our economic division. I see Dr. Prasad there with us. fundamental questions of disagreement, which the Commonwealth tackled head on and brought people around to a point where the international financial institutions took note of what the Commonwealth was doing towards developing convergence. We seem to have given up trying to develop those convergences in that field. I don't, Dr. Prasad probably knows more about this than me now, but I doubt if the division that he headed still exists. And what you say about Jeremy Pope, I couldn't agree with more. To my credit, Jeremy Pope was the first person I appointed when I became Secretary. So that's how much I think of Jeremy Pope. Yes, I would like to see a vibrant, modern legal division headed by someone of the quality of Jeremy. But before I finish addressing you, let me say that one of the areas of optimism for me about the Commonwealth's future, are organizations like yours. Forget for a moment the politicians. Think of the Commonwealth folk who get together on the basis of their like interests. The lawyers who want to see the rule of law preserved and can do it among themselves under a Commonwealth banner. The future of the Commonwealth has much to do with your successes, not the other way around, that the politicians must succeed in order for you to be effective. Your effectiveness may bring them to both.
Okay, thank you. Keith and then Martin.
My question is really, in a way, echoes something that Peter said there.
Sorry, who are you?
Oh, sorry, Keith Somerville, Institute of Commonwealth Studies in the University of Kent. During your period in office, 75 to 90, the Cold War was the dominant framework for international politics. And Southern Africa, the fight against the minority rule regimes, was, if you like, the dominant issue in South Africa within a Cold War context. Once that context had been removed and the Southern African conflicts as they were had been removed, do you think it in a way made it more difficult for CHOGMs and for Secretaries General to deal with the issues that came up, issues like Sri Lanka, issues like the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa?
I don't see why. After all, the negative, you present the Cold War as having a positive effect on the Commonwealth.
No, as a framework within existing, which set a seed.
Doesn't it come down to that? Mrs. Thatcher presented two personalities as between Rhodesia and South Africa. Because in South Africa she was driven by Cold War imperatives and a close relationship with Ronald Reagan. That was not so in Rhodesia. And it was that compulsion not to knock apartheid, driven by Cold War considerations, at least in part, that created so many problems. All right, the Cold War has gone. Why should the problems be greater?
because you're now dealing with problems much more within individual member states rather than, if you like, overarching ideological or rival nationalist ideas. Suddenly you're getting to the heart of a member state's policies and behaviour rather than perhaps broader issues within groups within the Commonwealth. Become personal, if you like, rather than just business.
I believe that is, forgive the word, simplistic. There may be individual situations in which the absence of a Cold War mechanism that can influence policy may make things worse. But I think there will be individual, not general. I don't think, for example, when the EPG produced its splendid report, that it saw the Commonwealth as facing a more difficult future because the Cold War environment was not going to be part of the future. Sir Ronald can tell me if I'm wrong. But here are Commonwealth folk looking at the Commonwealth of the future. I don't recall any sense in which they thought it would be harder without the beneficial elements of the Cold War. I don't think I can agree with that.
Martin Clark, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and formerly with the BBC World Service. When you were Secretary General, you were the face of the Commonwealth, and you shaped opinion in this country and across the world. And your successors took similar roles, not always as high profile, but certainly were there. In the last few years, this has not taken place, and the Commonwealth has closed itself up like a clam. How damaging do you think this has been?
How
damaging?
Very. Okay. Peter. Yeah.
Peter Williams, Commonwealth Institute for Education. So Shridath, in your time, the CHOGMs were longer, which gave time to play through some of these issues. But also, it's probably true that many of the main actors who you referred to, because they were the fathers of the nation, they were very long-serving, and so you had time to get to know them. I mean, we mentioned Lee Kuan Yew, Nyerere, Manley, perhaps, Kaunda. Do you think that now, short of CHOGMs, terrible problems for the Commonwealth Secretary General of continuity, did you in your time have to adopt particular strategies to encourage Commonwealth champions to emerge from among the leaders, and can you suggest ways in which this can be done? We in education find this a terrible problem at the lower level of ministers' meetings. I mean, you only get a quarter of the ministers have been at a Commonwealth ministers' meeting last time 3 years ago, and so this essence of having good personal relationships as a basis for diplomacy, together with a longer meeting, which is actually lost. I mean, other strategies that the Secretary General can employ to encourage champions and leaders of the Commonwealth to come forward and to help us with all these challenges we face?
Yes, Peter, the absence of longevity in Commonwealth leadership. There are many who were leaders throughout my 15 years. Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister for 11 of my 15 years. Lee Kuan Yew, all. Kaunda, all. Nyerere, all. So, we worked hard as a Commonwealth to further democracy, to undo that propitious environment. So you're not saying we won't get away with it. We have to face a Commonwealth in which there are going to be more frequent changes of leadership. Aren't we? So we have to work harder at converting a ruling leadership to the Commonwealth and its benefits, its values. One responsibility for the Secretary General is that he has got to get alongside them as they emerge, before they emerge, and get them committed to the Commonwealth. We've got to use the institutions that help build aspiring politicians, like the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, so that they become members of the Commonwealth before they become Prime Minister. I don't think we work hard enough at that. Maybe we never did because we never had to, but we certainly have to now. The Commonwealth has to be more visible in countries. And I think the Commonwealth has to make more use of non-governmental organizations like the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, so that they become the lifeblood of the Commonwealth within countries. It's a very challenging prospect. Maybe the job is harder than it was when I was there, but the challenge has to be met.
There's a question at the back.
Yeah,
And then
my name is Anna. I'm an MA student at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. My question was, I hear what you're saying about the golf and the camaraderie and the coming together, but all that is here. And the way I see it, we've spent and we are continuing to invest politically, monetarily, in terms of time, effort, into keeping this cozy, this level. But everything here, we've lost the plot here. And the people here, that's the people the Commonwealth is made up of. And they're still here. They're still developing. We're still on a crutch. We're still termed Commonwealth. At what point do we lose that branding? At what point do you develop? And if majority of the people over here at this level have no faith in this level, why are we still clinging on to this? I know you're hell-bent and you completely believe in reviving, keeping the Commonwealth alive, but I don't, and I don't see why when no one here wants it.
It's the disconnect between the leaders. You talk about the leaders bonding, but what about the people? You know, the vast majority of people. What connection do they have with the Commonwealth?
Well, that is what I was saying just now. That we have to develop mechanisms. You know, we had, I don't know how live it is now, but it was in my time that, or just before, that we invented Commonwealth Day. And the Commonwealth Secretariat, in my time, devoted a lot of effort and energy, Patsy Robertson is here, to making the Commonwealth, to generating Commonwealth awareness on that day. Putting out materials, developing radio programs, so that at least for one day, the people became aware of the Commonwealth and aware of it as an enlightened and modern organization, not a relic of the past. It's that kind of thing that we have to do more. How else do you reach young people? We have the Commonwealth Youth Program. It was the first activity that was decentralized in the Commonwealth. We had a program office in Asia, in Africa, and the Caribbean. I hear, maybe somebody can confirm it or deny it, that they're closing the offices. That means less visibility for the Commonwealth in those regions. Why? That is a lack of foresight of what the real needs are.
Did I do justice to your question? You want to come back on that?
No, I get the answer he's saying, but again in my head all I'm hearing is we're spending this much time creating a day, spending this much time creating campaigns and awareness to keep and sell an institution. Where are we selling the work? Where is the work? We're spending a day, we're having Commonwealth Games where again countries spending in more money. But it's all on PR. The connect that you're saying, it's unnecessary. You're spending this much to keep an institution alive which is supposed to help people when you can just directly do that, when states themselves can do that. And this goes back to what the gentleman there was saying. Individual states' needs have changed. It's no longer that the conversation has changed. It has to change, rather.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. Yeah.
My name's Terry Dormer. I worked in the Commonwealth Secretariat from 1971 to 2003. Absolutely splendid speech, Sir Shridath. 1,000 thanks for that. But I just wanted to come back on your comment on the chair in office. It reminds me of the story of the tourist in Ireland who got lost in his car and sought directions, only to be told, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. We are now in a bit of a pickle in the Commonwealth on many fronts, but just to deal with the issue of chair in office, what should we do? What should be done, do you think? I mean, is it just a matter of sackcloth, ashes, prayer and fasting, or can something be done to address what is a very serious problem?
Yes, perhaps the government should take a decision that they are, after all, going to accept the recommendation of the EPG and abolish the chair in office.
Hear, hear.
Okay, there are quite a few questions left, very little time, so I'm going to take a few, and if you could be very, very brief, please. Yes.
Rosemary, Preston from Council for Education in the Commonwealth. I thank you, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation and its micro detail of these processes. Picking up on the debate just now, I think there is a case for talking of younger leaders that are there in every sphere. It's not just the Commonwealth that is having to engage with younger leaders. They're in business, politics, across the world, country by country. So the issue is, how are all the bodies dealing with this transition to enable meaningful, stable contributions to be made? Similarly,
Could I just sort of take a few further points, because as I say we're sort of running out of time.
My name is Raju Veswaran. I'm from King's College, retired 9 years ago, but I'm a peace and human rights activist. My question to you, sir, is in 2009 in Trinidad, Tobago, our Prime Minister then, Gordon Brown, wanted to change the venue when Sri Lanka wanted to host it. And he took the Australian Prime Minister to the side and said, can you host it for 2011, which was done. But 2011 in Perth, Canadian Prime Minister walked out saying he can't accept the what is called the core values of and the principles of Commonwealth it being abused. Only recently the Mauritius
question,
yeah. But Mauritius also has said the same thing. India, I don't want to say anything more. But what is there a mechanism you just said to change the chairmanship as a damage controlling exercise?
Okay, the question now, please. Yeah.
Anthony Elman, Commonwealth Secretariat employee for much of Sonny's time in office, now a member of Commonwealth Association. The association, as I'm sure you know, has been having a vigorous debate recently about the run-up to Colombo and fears of what may happen there and in the subsequent 2 years. Is there any way that this debate and the expertise that exists within the association can be brought to bear in support of the Secretariat and the Commonwealth in the way that you said the Commonwealth Legal Association, Parliamentary Association, and so on?
Thank you very much. And did you want to ask a question? All right. Okay. Well, I think we've got 3 questions, very little time, so if you'd like to... maybe the last one,
Same question.
Yeah.
It's the same question we have asked many from...
Yeah. The sort of the Commonwealth Association. Do you want to just...
To repeat the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, what I said was that there has been there is still going on a big debate within the Commonwealth Association on our fears of what may happen in Colombo and in the subsequent 2 years. There is a lot of expertise within the association. Is there a way in which this can be brought to bear in support of the future of the Commonwealth, the Secretariat itself, as well as the other institutions? You mentioned the Lawyers Association.
It's about, it's generally about our recent, what have we learned, I suppose, in the last 4 or 5 years that could help us make the Commonwealth more effective? It's about learning from our mistakes, but also drawing on our experience.
You know, we had that exercise. We appointed a high-level group of Commonwealth folk. The governments really have not paid proper attention to it. And had they done so, I think you would have first of all had effective consultations. If you don't want to accept the recommendations of a guru group, they wanted themselves to have consultations across the country. That process, that consultative process, would itself have been a unifying factor in the government. So the leadership has to take substantial responsibility for the sense of decline that I encounter everywhere. We need champions. You know, when you think back to a person like Kenneth Callender, he was a fighter in UDI, a fighter in apartheid, but he was a Commonwealth man to the core. And of course, we have a situation where over those halcyon days, the Queen had grown up with those leaders. Nyerere was a young man as she was developing her connections with the Commonwealth. She understood his aspirations and could relate to him, and he to her. That was a very important bonding factor.
which was to produce practical results. But there are other questions.
And I think the lady about was talking about the learning from youth and sort of youth leadership design.
What I didn't get to was the thing, I am really worried the number of times in the last 2 or 3 weeks I've been at meetings such as this, and I've heard elder generation, particularly men, saying and vaunting it with praise, we are a club. This falls on uncomfortably on the ears of women. It falls very uncomfortably on those not of elite statuses
But they don't say
and
we're a
classes.
gentleman's club.
No, but it resonates in that way. And people, the question that said we've become closed, looking in on ourselves, this is the language that creates that closure.
I think I'd retract our premises. I never liked club because in my mind it had connotations of an all boys club. What I found was that the Commonwealth-like club, African countries in particular, it has always bewildered me, but the club concept appealed to them, gave the Commonwealth a shape and meaning that had eluded me, but was to the ultimate good of the Commonwealth, of the club. Okay, if you see the Commonwealth as a club, which you are happy to be a member of, then okay, that's good for the Commonwealth. If anybody was to say to me it's a gentleman's club, I would be as fiercely objecting as you are.
Well, club or not, we have sorry, I can not allow
Philip, I really wanted to say, I'm sorry, Ronald Sanders. The only thing I wanted to say in relation to the matter of the club, Commonwealth High Commissioners in Britain enjoy a status in this country because the Queen is the head of the Commonwealth that irritates many ambassadors from countries much larger and more powerful than ourselves, including incidentally the United States ambassador, because Commonwealth High Commissioners are given precedence over all other ambassadors. That club makes the Commonwealth rather unique, not only in this country, but in all Commonwealth countries, and it is to the Commonwealth's good.
Oh well, we've got rules of our own in this particular institution, which we had to stop for tea at 4:15. But we will resume in about 20 minutes or so to launch our website. Before we move to tea, let us give a rousing round of applause for